Welcome to the NBA Trades Podcast. I'm your host, Raphael, and today I have a special guest. It's former Rockets general manager Steve Patterson. Now, Steve was the Rockets general manager from 1989 to 1993. He got his start in the sports industry at childhood. He was the son of Ray Patterson, who was president of the Milwaukee Bucks. So I talked to Steve about his run in Houston, working with his dad with the Rockets since he worked throughout the 80s before he became general manager, and then his rise to GM, becoming the youngest general manager in the NBA, how he helped bring the All-Star game to Houston, how he installed a ticketing system for the Rockets when he was working in the marketing department in the 80s. We then went through the his entire run as general manager for the Rockets. So that means acquiring Vernon Maxwell and Kenny Smith in trades, drafting Robert Horry, Sam Cassell, trading for Mario Elie, and then also the Akeem Olajuwon situation where Akeem Olajuwon wanted out of Houston, had contract disagreements, and made it public. And so we went in depth about sort of the trade offers that Steve got, dealing with an unhappy superstar and having to handle that whole situation. So we went from that all the way until the end when the team was bought by Les Alexander in 1993, and then Steve was let go soon after. So hope you enjoy and check it out. So when you started off, your dad worked as an executive for the Milwaukee Bucks, so you were around sports. What was that like in your life growing up?
Well, it was interesting because I actually started when I was about 10 years old answering the phone for the Milwaukee Bucks before we had any furniture. And, the league was much smaller then. The revenues were smaller. The offices were smaller. The media exposure was smaller. But, it was fun as a kid being around the game. The Milwaukee Arena was a great old building, really tight, small building. You could see it over 10,000. So fans were right on top of the game. And the teams and players were closer. You didn't have everybody flying on charters. You traveled with the other teams often, traveled with the referees often. And so it was a more close-knit group than it is today.
And so the Bucks won a championship in 1971. So for you as a adolescent, as a young person, what was it like going through that experience of getting to see a team win a championship? And like you said, the camaraderie, everybody's so much more close-knit just because of the different atmosphere and the different time period. What was it like to sort of see a championship won and to see that dream realized for a bunch of people, from executive to coach to players?
Well, there was a lot less media presence, so actually won it on the road in Baltimore, and so you didn't really have a chance to see it the same way you do today. But it happened so fast, I think people got a little bit spoiled. Winning 60-odd games, in the third year and winning it was a tremendous accomplishment, but you had great players, Kareem and Oscar, of course, is some of the all-time greatest. And there was a dominant, fun team to watch. And had all five of the starters shoot over 50%, which was kind of amazing. But it really was a great testament to what a great point guard Oscar Robertson was, because he got the ball to people where they could score easily. But it was exciting, but I would say it didn't have the same media presence that it does today in the community.
Yeah. Did you always know that you wanted to work in sports, from working at such an early age and getting to see up close what the whole business was like?
No, it really wasn't a plan. The league changed dramatically as you got into the early and mid 80s. The businesses changed. They became less mom and pop operations and more professionalized. it was a greater need for people that had legal training. As the dollars got bigger, the contracts get more complicated, and the salary cap came in. So those were all changes that meant that a different set of skills was going to be required. So we put the first computer network in any professional sports team. We built our own ticketing system. I handled all the contracts, the salary cap permutations to do deals, and so it was beginning to change, and guys like David Stern and Larry Fleischer helped professionalize the league and give it a structure that they could grow in.
And so when you joined the Rockets, you had went to law school and eventually ended up at the Rockets. What was it like working with your dad?
It was a lot of fun. We're sort of different characters. He tends to think if he thinks of something that it's done, you actually have to go finish it, do it. But he was a great mentor. We had a lot of fun working together. Charlie Thomas was a great owner to work with. He understood the marketplace, understood marketing. He had car dealerships, so when the economic downturn hit Houston from the S&L crisis in the mid '80s, and he knew if his dealership that he had in Galveston didn't sell any cars that month, it was going to be tough selling any tickets that month too, because it was discretionary income.
Oh wow! So for at that time, especially like you said, you worked in multiple fields for the Rockets. Working with contracts, also working with the marketing side of things, like you said, the ticket system. At that time, especially, like you said, that was the first time that a team really had done that. What was that like an easy thing to do or hard? Like, what do you remember about having to install that system and just sort of working on that side of things?
Well, what we were trying to do is move from manual processes to computerized processes. And so, for a lot of old school people, that was not going to be an easy transition. But it allowed us to have the highest season ticket base in the league with one of the smaller staffs in the league, because we had moved in a direction to automate so much of what we were doing. It was exciting and fun to build something new like that. It was a challenge at times, and we certainly had fits and starts, and some things that took a while to get worked through. But it was an exciting time as people moved away from big mainframes and dumb terminals towards having your own desktop, which was sort of new at the time, and you had Compaq, which was a manufacturer in the Houston area at the time. And so it was much, I suppose, the way people felt 20, 30 years ago in Silicon Valley, where you're sort of changing how the business operates, and that's a lot of fun.
And also with the Rockets at that time, they probably had one of the more interesting runs in the '80s. From being an NBA finalist with Moses Malone, to having to rebuild, to then drafting Akeem Olajuwon and Ralph Sampson, and then becoming an NBA finalist again. So you sort of get to see both sides of the winning side, being a contender, being a competitive team, and also sort of being a team that is struggling and trying to figure things out and trying to rebuild. What's the difference? Like, I guess maybe the atmosphere around the organization on both sides.
Right. Well, you had a team that made a run to the finals that was largely a 500 ball club that Moses carried to the finals. And then the free agency rules were changing, and so he signed with Philadelphia. Basically, his contract was as large as what Charlie Thomas had just paid to buy the entire franchise. Um, and so the decision was made to rebuild. Um, rebuilding is never fun. It's one thing to say we're going to go through this and rebuild, but the problems that come out of it, the personality conflicts, the veteran guys that aren't getting minutes and complain about it and whatnot, are difficult for them in their career. It's difficult for the fans. But it's a process generally that every team that ultimately is going to be successful has to go through. But, when you got Akeem and Ralph and John Lucas and guys like that, it was an exciting, fun team that ran, put a lot of points on the board. There's a lot of energy around the team and excitement because you could see what was coming, and barring sort of injuries and some of the issues with drugs that some of the guys had around that time, it was a lot of fun to watch it move forward.
Yeah, and you just made an interesting point. The drug situation with players and sort of dealing with that. It's sort of specific to that generation, the '80s and the NBA. How hard was it as an executive or somebody working with a franchise? Just how difficult that situation? Because it really didn't just affect the Rockets. I mean, the Phoenix Suns drug scandal. There were a few other situations that happened, or just like specific individual players. What what was it like dealing with it at that specific time?
Well, we have guys that run afoul of the rules and get kicked out of the league for a couple of years. You just don't have the assets to replace those guys immediately. So it's going to have a negative impact on the team. It's going to have a negative impact on the brand of the franchise. It's going to have a negative impact on how the fans feel about the team. But at the same time, I think it was something that had to happen because you couldn't have guys continuing to get in trouble and get killed in car wrecks and potentially be leveraged by gamblers or others, because of their drug habits. But it was shocking and it was difficult to deal with, and I think the league sort of struggled with implementation and fairness across all the teams and across all the players, and I think it's good that the league's come through it and cleaned itself up. It was certainly something that when you had guys running afoul of it, you get sponsors that don't want to be associated with that, season ticket holders that don't want to be associated with that. So although it was difficult, I think it was something that the league had to go through and do for the long-term benefit of everybody.
I guess you would call it like growing pains. Yeah, so 1989, you were hired as a general manager of the Rockets. For you, you were the youngest GM ever in history. I think you were 31 at the time. How did you feel coming into that role, and what did you expect coming into that role?
Well, I was excited. I'd been involved in a lot of everything that we had done prior to that date, whether it was negotiating player contracts, negotiating trades, negotiating coaching contracts. And I'd had a chance to work with Ray, my father, for a lot of years, and with Charlie Thomas, the owner, did it for a number of years. There are some people that sort of criticized the move, but that's to be expected in the business. You can't really let that bother you. You just got to go about your job, doing the best you can do. And we had some deals that worked, and some probably didn't. But we put together a team that got back to the finals and ultimately won it, which is always a difficult building process.
Yeah, and so I mean, one thing I think about and right now is Flip Saunders, Ryan Saunders, his son, is the coach, and it's a really positive story. But for you, did you ever feel like maybe you had something extra to prove because people might feel like, oh, he just got the job because of nepotism, because he's Ray Patterson's son? Did you ever feel like pressure to live up to that expectation, or prove people wrong, maybe who felt that way?
I didn't really worry about it as trying to prove people wrong. I got up every day and tried to do the best I could for the franchise and the fans and the owner and the employees. And you let the chips fall where they may. I didn't. I wasn't going to work any harder. I mean, I was working as hard as you could, and I don't really sort of evaluate my performance by what some third party might say that really doesn't understand or know all the facts.
And so when you took over, you made, like you said, you made some big moves leading into their championship run in 1994 and 95, the back-to-back run. But first, I wanted to talk about, you also helped bring the All-Star game to Houston in 1989. Could you tell me what that experience was like, and sort of the run up to that, and just how you were able to get that situation worked out where the Summit could host an All-Star game?
Yeah, so we viewed it as something that would be beneficial to the franchise as a whole, and beneficial to the community. It's provides great exposure for the city, and certainly fills up the hotel rooms and the restaurants, and it's an economic benefit. And it was something that Ray wanted to do, and Charlie wanted to do. And so, yeah, I led that effort, and we put together a deal to play All-Star Saturday at the Summit, and then All-Star Sunday, the actual All-Star game, in the Astrodome. And the building was under construction. We were changing over from the old building that was sort of more configured for baseball to add additional seats for the Oilers. So the big scoreboard in the outfield was going away, the sort of historic Astrodome scoreboard. But it was great to work with the folks at the county and at the Astros and at the Astrodome. And it was kind of interesting to be there during the game and be down on the floor, because the majority of the seating was back quite a ways from the floor. So, you could walk around the floor of the game, and it was like watching guys, in the park or at the local gym, because you could hear all the tennis shoe squeaks and you could hear the guys talk to each other. But generally there was silence outside of that around the court itself. But then when somebody would score or, dunk or steal or something, you'd hear this roar from further away in the building, and it would there'd be a little time lag before it got to you. So it was a real different experience watching the game as compared to where you've got the fans right on top of the court, which is the way it is most of the time. But, Houston's a great town for big events like that. The city did a great job putting it on, and that game held the record for a couple of decades till Jerry Jones had an All-Star game in the Cowboys building in Dallas, and so we were real proud of what happened with the game. That was in the old days, and the whole building was hard tickets, so we actually had to fly to New York and pick up all the tickets and put them in these great big duffel bags and carry them back onto the airplane, and filled up all the overhead bins in first class. It was before the days of restrictions on what you could bring on board, and had to do it in a relatively secretive manner, because you're walking around with millions and millions and millions of dollars of tickets. But we weren't going to let them out of our sight. So
Oh, wow.
we got them back and sold it out. 44,000 people.
Wow, that's amazing. So, how did that even come into your mind to the Astrodome part of it, to have the All-Star game in, it's something that's not necessarily, I guess you would say, conventional at the time? I mean, especially since that's the first time, like you
Right.
said. Yeah.
Well, from our standpoint, we had, I don't know, 14,000 season ticket holders or something, and the league would need 7 or 8 thousand seats, and what we didn't want to have happen is to displace half our season ticket holders from coming to the All-Star game. So the way to make it work was to do the Saturday in the Summit, and if people wanted to see those events, that was probably big enough. We didn't need to have 40,000 seats for All-Star Saturday, but this way everybody who wanted to have seats to go to the game could get seats and get good seats, and if they wanted to get a few extras for their friends and family, they could do that. And so it really was a great celebration for all of the fans, all the season ticket holders, and the community as a whole.
Yeah. So going back to the Rockets, like the team specifically, so you made a couple of big trades early on in your time, within like the first year. You acquired Vernon Maxwell from the Spurs on February 21st, 1990, for cash, and you also made a trade later on that year for Kenny Smith from Atlanta. It was a four-player trade with Roy Marble, Tim McCormick, and John Lucas also involved. Those two guys ended up becoming really impactful players, important players to the makeup of that team, especially later on. How did you think to acquire them, and what were you looking to build around Akeem Olajuwon as sort of the centerpiece of that team?
Well, we needed help in the backcourt. Vernon is one of the best all-around athletes I've ever seen or worked with. A really tough guy. We needed some toughness in the backcourt. He and the coach weren't getting along in San Antonio at the time. Bob Bass was the GM, and so they were going through changes on their roster, and Vernon was available, and they actually wanted to cut him, and it was a way. The cash was a way for us to basically get to the top of the waiver wire and get him for very little. Vernon did a great job for us for a lot of years, and we wouldn't have won a championship without him. He had a temper, and he had to manage that, and it wasn't always easy. But we tried to help surround him with some of the veterans that could help him deal with that. But it's kind of a fine line between dealing with his temper and his emotional volatility and what that toughness brought you on the court. And, you could have maybe two guys, but generally one guy like that, because you don't want a second guy for them to run around with. But it worked for us with Vernon. And, when we had to have somebody tough to guard Michael Jordan, he could do it. Kenny Smith, we wanted some speed and some shooting, and he could do that for us. Quality guy, good family. Came out of Dean Smith's program, so he knows basketball. We were looking for somebody that could start in the backcourt and play the point for us, and he was a good fit for the club we had. We wanted to run and play fast, and he had a major presence down on the block with Olajuwon and certainly Otis Thorpe after I got him, and Kenny gave us somebody who could consistently shoot the three and also play fast and get up and down the floor fast, get a lot of speed. So, and was a real quality person. So it was a good fit for us.
And that year you signed another guard. You signed Sleepy Floyd to a 4-year contract. What did you see in Sleepy? Like, he was a veteran. He's most famously known for that playoff eruption against the Lakers when he was with the Warriors. What were you looking to get out of him when you signed him?
Well, again, he could score, play in the backcourt. You know, Sleepy could have huge games like that, and then not consistently produce all the time. But he had a good career, and we thought that he could continue to play at the level that he had for the couple of years before that. That didn't necessarily turn out to be the case, but at the time, there weren't a lot of options for who, if you weren't going to sign him and extend him, there weren't a lot of options to replace him with.
Yeah. So that team, your first 2 years running the team, they were 41-41, lost to the Lakers in the first round 3-1, and then the next year the team was 52-30, and they were swept by the Lakers 3-0. The Lakers were really good at that time. Obviously, the Magic Johnson led Lakers, and in '91, the game 3 where Otis Thorpe on the inbounds play didn't call a timeout and a 5-second violation. Do you remember that situation and just sort of running into the Lakers those 2 years and just how tough Magic and that combination with James Worthy too on that team, how tough it was playing them?
Oh yeah, they were a great ball club, and if you're playing in the West at that time, in the '80s and early '90s, that's who you had to knock off, and the battles they had with the Celtics and Pistons and whatnot for years in the finals were great battles. But you got Kareem and Magic and Worthy and Byron Scott. That's pretty tough to go up against. Wilkes, that's a pretty tough crew to go up against every night. So, when we got to the point that we knocked them off, it was a great accomplishment for the franchise. But yeah, you're going to go through some growing pains trying to get there.
Yeah, so the team the next year, 91-92, is 42-40 that year, but they're 26-26 when Don Chaney is fired and replaced by Rudy Tomjanovich. The team ends up missing the playoffs, but do you remember making that decision to fire Don Chaney and hire Rudy, and how did you come to that decision at that time?
The move to make the change really was one that was driven by the owner. He wanted to make that change. Ray and I talked for weeks to him to try to talk him out of it, and but Charlie had his mind made up, and I can remember him actually saying to me, Steve, if you don't want to do this, then I don't need you around the general manager anymore. So, he was really set on wanting to make a change. So I met with Don and let him know we were going to make the change, and then I met with Rudy and Carol Dawson right after that. And San Antonio just made the change just before, roughly the same time, and Bob Bass, who was the GM, took over as coach. And so I met with Rudy and Carol and let him know that Don wasn't the coach anymore, and we were going to have to find somebody to replace him. And I told him, I'm not Bob Bass, so I'm not going to be coaching the club, so it's going to be one of the two of you guys. And Carol had some health issues and some vision issues, and I think we all were concerned that although he was a great coach and a great basketball mind, his health probably wasn't good enough for him to take the stress of being the head coach. And so we looked at Rudy and said, so that leaves you, Rudy. And, he didn't initially really want to do it. He was very loyal to Don, and so I had an idea who the outside people might be. and they weren't real excited about working for any of those guys. So we talked Rudy into doing it, and it worked out in the long run, very well. You look at sort of replacing Don playing as well as we had played. I think everybody was a little surprised, but that's what Charlie wanted, and he's the owner of the team, and that's his prerogative.
And for Rudy, as essentially, I mean, was he an interim coach, like listed for the rest of that season as an interim?
Yeah, initially, and then we did talk to some other folks, and ultimately settled on having Rudy come back as the permanent head coach.
Oh, how did you come to? I know he went 16 and 14 the rest of the way. How did you come to that decision to keep him on permanently?
Well, I think everybody thought he did a good job, and was able to get satisfactory results out of the players. He'd been with the franchise forever. He worked his way up from being a scout all the way up to a top assistant, and then as an interim head coach. We talked to a number of other folks, including Mike Fratello and some others at the time, and after sitting down with Charlie and talking, I think we all felt best with moving forward with Rudy on the bench.
And throughout the course of that season, another thing happened, which was late in the season, around late March. Keem Olajuwon, you suspended him without pay because he said he was physically unable to play because he was suffering from a hamstring injury. And you were saying he was physically able to do so. Doctors had cleared him to play. And, it led to a lot of back and forth in the media. And do you remember that situation? It's something I think in a weird way is sort of forgotten in Akeem's career because of the championships and sort of that era pre the success of the team and the championships. But what was that like when he first did that? I know him renegotiating his contract was also a big point of contention between the club and him throughout a lot of the early part of his tenure with the Rockets.
Yeah, Akeem is an interesting character. He's a very competitive person, both on the floor and off the floor. And off the floor, that meant whenever somebody else, another player in the league, got a new contract or signed a free agent contract or what have you, he always wanted to look at whatever individual piece of that contract might be better, and never wanted to recognize that, negotiations, you trade some things for other things, right? So, he'd want a shorter contract for more money, and then he'd want a longer contract for more money, and the guy wanted to renegotiate every 6 months, sometimes every 6 weeks, and he just didn't have a concept of honoring the piece of paper that he'd signed. So he was difficult in that respect to deal with. And so, some of that got out publicly and a lot of it didn't. But ultimately we reached a point where Charlie wasn't going to renegotiate yet again. We'd just done it, and given him everything he asked for, and totally had his commitment. Yeah, this is the last time. This is what I really want. He said all the right things, but he didn't mean it. And so literally, and he had been calling Charlie and calling me. I met with him and just told him we're not going to renegotiate it again. This is nuts. We're doing this every few months. And it made it impossible or very difficult to try to build a team around him because, you're operating within the constraints of the cap. You had the older teams that had their guys signed before the cap came into effect. So Boston and LA, so at that period in time, there was, points in time where their payroll was like 3 times what ours was in Houston. And so you wonder why they had better players. Well, they got grandfathered in. You could go over the cap to sign your own players or keep your own players. And they had older, better players. So I met with Akeem and the day before that and told him we're not renegotiating yet again. And he literally said to me, "You want me to be happy, don't you?" I said, at this juncture, Akeem, I don't care whether you're happy or not. We've given you everything you've asked for. We're not renegotiating again. So he walked out of the office and the next morning he came in and literally was jogging down the hallway to the to the locker room. I get a call from the trainer a couple minutes later, and I saw him running him. He was late to practice. And he was jogging down the hall. And he comes in, and the trainer says, "Well," he says, "he's got a pulled groin." And I said, "Oh, yeah, well, show me." And, so we go in there. Akeem starts telling me he's got a pulled hamstring. and I have to go, "Well, which is it, Akeem? Is it a pulled groin or a pulled hamstring? And where is it?" And, he can't locate it. Well, if you've ever pulled your groin or pulled a hamstring, you know exactly where it is. And you're not jogging down the hallway to practice. So I went out and called Charlie and came back, talked to him. And when I came back, he pointed to a different place on his leg than he had, 15 minutes before. So, if you're going to get your story down and fake an injury, you ought to at least know what you're faking and be consistent about it. And so, it was obvious that he was pulling our chain. And so, yeah, we suspended him without pay. And, I had to go through a whole battle with him. Ultimately, the next season when we flew over to Japan, he and Charlie got together and got a chance to talk because they were stuck on the plane together for 8 or 10 hours, and finally got it worked out. And we didn't have any more problems with the contracts with him.
Yeah. At that time, when there's discord and it's public, the NBA is a circle of birds looking at prey down under on the ground, and you have all these teams. From what I read, there were 26 rumored teams to have offered a trade, like trying to trade for him. For you, what's it like when you have like a star player and everyone is sort of sees that as prey? Like, okay, how can we get this guy? And you get every kind of offer under the sun for him. What's that process like, and sort of dealing with all these teams sort of contacting you and trying really hard to get Akeem?
Well, that's what happens is they do circle like birds of prey, and so they're not trying very hard to get him. They're trying to steal him from you. So, Jerry West calls up and offers you the last 4 guys at the end of the bench, and can't understand why you don't want to make that kind of a deal because some guy hasn't played for half the year, such a great player. How could you not want to do this, Steve? We did have a lot of conversations with a lot of folks. The Clippers probably had the most assets and made the most sincere run. Akeem had said he wanted to go to LA. So they tried. But ultimately we couldn't ever quite get to a deal. I think we got close, but we decided to stay and duke it out. And, generally once you get to that point, it's awfully hard for the team that's trading, a star player away to get back equal value. It rarely happens. And so, in that environment, the players got a lot of leverage.
Yeah. So another move you made. So after that season, it's in June. You're in the draft, and you selected Robert Horry with your first round pick, and it led to a chorus of boos from fans in the Summit who were at the draft party for the Rockets. At that time, a lot of people thought Harold Miner was the next coming of Michael Jordan, so He was sort of
the baby Jordan.
Yeah, he was the sexy NBA pick. A lot of teams sort of passed on him, but at that time, a lot of people thought he should have gone higher. Even Robert Horry, from what I read in a story, said that he was shocked that he was picked over Harold Miner. So, do you remember that day making the pick and sort of the reaction from the fan base, but also what you saw in Robert Horry that maybe he was less heralded than a player like Harold Miner, and what you saw in him that maybe other people didn't see in what he can provide on the court?
Right. Well, part of the general manager's job when you're going into the draft is to sort of prep the fan community for what you're going to do. And historically, you could communicate through various media members. And those media guys could look real smart because they would be picking the guy, telling the fans who we were going to pick, and then we'd pick the guy and he'd look smart. The reality was there was a lot of competition for Robert Horry, and people behind us, Miami, Detroit, I think, and a couple others were trying to evaluate where they're going to have to move up to get in front of us to take Horry. And so there comes a certain point in time where if you're trying to get the player you want to get, we didn't want to have to give up a bunch of assets to move up yet again in the draft. You have to maybe not be as forthcoming as you otherwise might want to be, right, with the other GMs and with the press. And so because we knew we had a couple of teams that wanted to move in front of us, you couldn't do the normal thing of saying, oh, these three guys are great and we're going to pick one of them. We sort of had to bullshit and say, oh yeah, baby Jordan, he's really great. And maybe we're not so high on Robert Horry, so that the other clubs would stop trying to move up and get in front of us to take Horry when Horry is who we really wanted. You look at Big Shot Bob's career, half a dozen rings. The guy makes a great entry pass. He's a great defensive player for years. He could guard all five positions. He had, 7-foot wingspan. Won a lot of ball games for teams for a long, long time in the NBA. And smart, really smart player, quality human being. He had Spreewell with him on that Alabama team. And we just never were that high on Harold Miner. He scored a lot of points. And, that's sort of what most unsophisticated fans just look at. But we just weren't that high on him. We thought he was small and he was a minor league version of what people thought of Michael Jordan. In a very short time period, that proved out to be the case. So yeah, we went after Horry. The community and the media were not ready for that. We had, throughout that time, big draft night parties, and yeah, I had to step out on a stage and 10,000 people booing us. So that wasn't a lot of fun, but it was the right thing to do to get the right guy for the franchise. And so some of those picks, like Sam Cassell and Robert Horry, really made a difference. And the guy that really did the most work for us was a fellow named John Kilday, who was scouting the colleges for us. And he did a great job and was a great proponent of Horry's, and without him we wouldn't have picked him, and we probably wouldn't have picked Sam Cassell either.
Yeah,
he deserves a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, so that team, so 92-93 is really the start of the teams starting to become a contender. Like the 55 wins that year, one of the top teams in the West. And what I always found interesting about that team was just sort of the inside-out style of just how the Rockets played. Akeem being this key post-up player, Otis Thorpe also being a really good post-up player, and just playing three guys out so that they could kick it out in terms of just double teams. And so the Rockets were that year I think led the NBA in 3-pointers made per 100 possessions. Were in the top 2 in 3-pointers attempted per 100 possessions. So the Rockets were a team that really embraced the 3-pointer at a time when the 3-point shot was still developing in terms of teams taking it with regularity. Was that always something that you wanted to see in the team, or how did that philosophy of just being an inside out team that does take a lot of threes but also has two key players in the post who can make plays, was that always the philosophy that you had for the Rockets?
Well, you had to have it if you were going to play Olajuwon down on the blocks and Otis Thorpe down on the blocks, because otherwise they just sag. Other teams would just sag their defenses in and make it harder and harder for those guys to operate. But part of the discussion and Akeem's maturation was getting him to give the ball up. It was also incumbent upon the organization to surround him with guys that could, make the threes when he did, so that it was inefficient offense. And when we got guys like Horry and Kenny Smith and Scotty Brooks and Cassell and Vernon, and you had guys that could shoot the threes and make them. And so, that made Akeem much more willing to give up the ball to those guys. And ultimately, I think all great players go through this phase where they've got to recognize that if they really want to win, they got to give the ball up. They can't do it all 100% themselves. And so, it kind of doesn't matter who you look at over time until those great players make that adjustment. They don't win championships. And so once Akeem did that, we became a very dangerous team. And, you had guys like, there's probably not a guy out there who's better at making an entry pass than Robert Horry. And so being able to have he and Olajuwon play together, and when the ball comes back out, you got a guy who's got basically 7 feet tall making a 3-pointer or getting the ball back into him. It was tough to play against for the other teams.
Yeah, so the team made the playoffs the first round. They beat the Clippers in 1993, 3-2 in a really competitive series, and then went on to play the Supersonics in another equally good, or even it's probably one of the better second round playoff series of that decade, that era. It went 7 games. The Supersonics won at the end in a really tough and tight series. Just a lot of the games were competitive. Even though the team lost, you could see that this team was starting to figure out who they were, the identity of the team. For you, how did you feel seeing the team start to develop and grow, and like you said, Akeem becoming a much better player in terms of a teammate, making plays for other guys on the team, looking for that pass to find people? What did you see in that team by that time?
Well, I thought that it was kind of interesting that the trip to Japan to start the year, where we played 2 games against Seattle, and Otis Thorpe got sick, and so he missed one of those games, and we lost without him over there. Put us in a position where we didn't have home court in the playoffs when we played them. And with that being the case, we won all the games in Houston by decent margins, and we lost all the games in Seattle, in overtime or double overtime, by very small margins. So, and at that time, Seattle was a really good team, and so, yeah, I felt we were moving into the top echelon in the West, and could play with anybody, and certainly could play if we had the home court with anybody. I did think we made great progress, but it was also the time when the ball club got sold, and I didn't have a good feeling that after we lost that things were going to stay the same with the new owner.
Yeah, and so Les Alexander buys the team in late July, and you were able to make a few moves. Actually, your last you drafted Sam Cassell that year in the draft, and your last move was trading a draft pick for Mario Ellie. I think it was a second round pick to Portland. So it ended up like you added two of the key pieces added to that team that ended up winning a championship. So when Les Alexander bought the team from Charlie Thomas, like you said, you had a feeling already, and it happens a lot in sports, just in general, professional sports, or just any walk of life, that it's not your own guy. Like we see with the swirling rumors with Luke Walton and Magic Johnson with the Lakers right now, that there's always this possibility that they're going to let him go because he was not hired by Magic. For you, did you already see the writing on the wall, or like how did you feel when that process, that transaction of the team being bought happened?
Well, both Ed Schmidt, who was Charlie's right-hand man, and I begged Charlie not to sell the team because we could see the growth in the team and the growth in franchise values. And, it was something that Charlie decided he wanted to do, but he certainly, if he'd hung on to the team a couple more years, would have made, tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars more. So you could argue about whether it was the right thing to do or not at the time. He didn't maximize the asset value, but he did have other financial challenges going on in his life at the time. When Les bought the club, he and I are very different people. He wanted to blow up every deal that was there, no matter whether they were in writing or not. And, my father and I are the kind of people that operate on a handshake. And we had been operating in that city for, 30 plus years on a handshake with people. And Les wanted to breach every written contract we had. So, we weren't going to get along. And it's certainly his prerogative to have whoever he wants to run the franchise. He didn't like it that we drafted Sam Cassell, although it was certainly the right pick. Guy had a great career. They helped us win a championship. And the Mario Ellie deal, Les refused to approve for weeks and weeks and weeks. And Brad Greenberg, who was the GM in Portland at the time, and I had agreed on the deal. And I got to give Brad a lot of credit because he was good to his word and stuck with the deal when he could have certainly gone another direction. And that's a rarity in a lot of businesses. So, he deserves, I think, credit for that. But we didn't get the deal done until Rudy literally had us threaten to quit. It was such a one-sided deal and such a perfect deal, and we wouldn't have won the championship without it. Mario is far, far, far better player than a second round. Anybody going to get in the second round? So from our standpoint, it was a no-brainer. But Les thought he knew a lot about basketball, and so finally, after Rudy sort of threatened to quit unless we did it, he finally approved it. It got done.
Oh wow! So the team went on to win 2 championships. Now, for you assembled pretty much all of that team from Sam Cassell, Mario Ellie, to being there when Akeem was drafted. You had been with the organization for a long time. To all the other pieces, Robert Horry, Otis Thorpe being traded from the Kings to the Rockets in the mid to late '80s, and right. Kenny Smith and Vernon Maxwell. You had a key part in a lot of those players, a lot of the key guys on the team who were playing, and even 2 of the guys like Scott Brooks, Matt Bowler, you signed or traded for.
Yep.
So, for you at that time, are you rooting for the team when they're in the finals playing the Knicks? When How does
Yeah.
that do you find yourself still rooting for the team even during that process?
Well, I either signed or traded for everybody but Clement Johnson, everybody on the roster. So, uh, and all the coaches and all the trainers and all the equipment managers and all the assistant coaches and everybody else. So yeah, it was a team of my creation. So yeah, I wanted to see him win it. And, yeah, I was there at game 7 and yeah, I got the first championship hat out of the box and, went to the after game celebration with the team and, I put that team together. So built that championship team. And so I was, happy for the team, happy for the community, that we won it, happy for the folks that had, worked for so many years, either on the staff or as coaches or as owners, and struggled to get it there. And I thought it was great. At the time, you had some other teams that would win and there'd be riots in the streets, and everything was peaceful in Houston. And we had a great night and great parade after that. And so it was a great experience personally and for the community.
Yeah. So that team, the culmination of them being able to win a championship, be that kind of team. When we talk about team building in sports and just sort of trying to build a championship team, build a winning culture, for you, what do you think was the biggest key to building that team and sort of something that stood out to you about what made that team special?
Well, I think we had people that understood their roles. You had, a superstar in Olajuwon who was willing to do the right things to help us win. I think they were, for the most part, good people, and it was a team of character. And without each one of the people contributing, we wouldn't have won it. You had to have a guy like Scotty Brooks. You had to have a guy like Sam Cassell. You had to have a guy like Mario Ellie, and Carl Herrera played well for us. We got him from Europe. So each one of those guys has to play a small role, but an important role for you to win it. I mean, I remember playing Boston in the finals in '84 before that, and they got Bill Walton, and he got one big rebound in overtime to beat us, and it ultimately turned out to be the reason they won and we lost. And so sometimes the guys that you don't necessarily expect, he's a great player, had a great career, but people have to step up and hit the big shot or make sure they cover their defensive assignment and get the win.
And so, for I guess as like a final thing, do like a sort of a speed round, looking into just sort of your favorites or things that happened throughout your run with the Rockets. So, who was the hardest player to trade? A player that you felt like really bad about trading, or something that happened that made you feel, oh, this is tough. Like I really don't want to move this guy.
I don't think I have one. I think the deals we did, we had to do, and I think people understand it's part of the business, and though it might not be fun, you gotta do it.
Who was, I guess, in your time of trade talks and talking with other GMs, other executives around the league, who was an executive that you always felt like you talked the most with about just trades or just anything? Honestly, and it could be anything, but just an executive that you felt like you just talked to all the time just whether it be personnel or other things?
I didn't have one. I would speak to different people for different purposes, and um, so I got along well with Jerry Krause. A lot of guys didn't. I actually liked Jerry. Pat Williams I'd known for 40 years. McCloskey I thought was really a good operator, and I always enjoyed talking with him. Bob Bass, we were family friends. Scotty Layden and his dad, we were family friends. Jerry Reynolds, who ran Sacramento, we talked all the time. I kept trying to get Ainge off of him. He never would give them to me. I had a lot of respect for Checketts. I thought he did a great job at both teams. We'd spend a lot of time. Jerry West, was a classy operator. He'd always try to fleece you, but was a classy operator. So, there's a lot of guys I got along with. Bob Whitsitt, I got along with a lot of them in the league.
And also, what was the hardest trade to make in terms of maybe long negotiation process?
Probably Otis Thorpe, because it was in the middle of when the collective bargaining was getting negotiated, and we spent a good time. Actually flew up to Ohio, met with his agent, Phyllis Freed, and Larry Fleischer was also working on the deal with Phyllis, and Larry was at the same time negotiating for the union with the collective bargaining agreement. And so once we got the deal put together, there was sort of a short little window where there was part of the collective bargaining agreement that hadn't been settled yet. And so we were able to slip through a very narrow window, both in legal definition and in timing. And, Gary Bettman wasn't too happy about that, but we had to do what we had to do to make the franchise better. And, but it took months. But we got it done, and Otis did a great job for us.
Yeah, it was a trade with the Kings, Rodney McRae and Jim Peterson going to Sacramento right. for Otis Thorpe. And what's an underrated trade that you made that you feel like maybe it's Scott Brooks? I mean, trading him Minnesota and Houston. But was there a trade that stood out to you that maybe other people wouldn't focus on? They focus more on, say, like the Otis Thorpe one. Is there an underrated trade in your mind that you think about?
Well, I mean, $25,000 for Vernon Maxwell. That Scotty for a second-round pick. Minnesota had some difficulty with their cap, so we were able to give up a second and get Scotty, and played a lot of minutes. And Mario Ellie for a second. Those are all pretty tough to beat in terms of what you give up in value. But in those situations, I knew where people were on the cap. I knew where they were financially. I knew what they needed, and so I could give them what they needed, and we got what we needed.
And final question, for people who don't know anything about Akeem, on a day-to-day basis, what was Akeem Olajuwon like?
Well, he's a great competitor. He's very, very competitive. From a business standpoint, he was very difficult to deal with. But certainly, he had a great sense of humor, and he could be a lot of fun. But he was a load to handle on a daily business basis. And it really wasn't until he recognized that he had to make the guys around him better that he finally got to the point of being able to win a championship.
Yeah. Well, Steve, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me for the NBA Trades podcast. Really appreciate you taking the time.
Yep, happy to do it. Enjoyed it. Take care, Rafa.
All right, take care.
This has been another edition of the NBA Trades Podcast. Thank you for listening. You can subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, of course, and on Stitcher or on YouTube and on Google Play. So check it out. And follow me on Twitter, NBA_trades. Like the page on Facebook. And thank you. Peace.